Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Very good. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Thanks for visiting us today. A couple of announcements before we start the program. This Thursday is our final in the Vietnam War series. We'll be talking about West Virginia and Wheeling in the war with Hal Gorby. That's at 7 p.m. Thursday. And next Tuesday, a special program on the bicentennial of the visit of Lafayette to Wheeling. Dr. Iris DeRode, who's an expert on the French-American alliance during the Revolution, will give us a talk about Lafayette and his lifelong dedication to the cause of American independence. And on June 3rd, Bob Gaudio returns to sing James Taylor. If you like, you can get a copy of the new Upper Ohio Valley Historical Review with someone in this room is on the cover, I believe. But it's about the Wheeling Legends, a sequel. $10. Price has gone up, what can I say? Today we have with us James Froemel, who will be presenting Charles Schulz, creator of the Peanuts comic strip. You may have guessed that by now. In a moment, Mr. Schulz will join us to tell the story of his life and art, after which he will take questions from the audience. Now, after Mr. Schulz' Q&A concludes, James Froemel will join us to answer questions that Mr. Schulz would not be able to. So we've done this a few times now. I want to see how you do today. Do not ask Mr. Schulz questions that he cannot answer. But here he is. Please welcome Charles Schulz.
Thank you. Thank you. So wonderful to be here with you all today. My name is Charles Schulz, and some of you might know that name, but if you don't, that's okay. People are often more familiar with the characters I've created. Charlie Brown, Linus, Snoopy. I've drawn a few comic strips in my life, 17,897 of the Peanuts comic strip to be exact. But the most popular strip, or at least the one I get the most mail about, is this one where the kids, they're laying down in the grass and they're looking up at the clouds. And Linus says, "Do you see that one over there? In it, I see a profile of Thomas Eakins, the famous portrait artist. And in that group over there, I see a map of British Honduras. And in that big group over there, I see the stoning of Stephen. Off to one side, I see the Apostle Paul standing there." And Lucy says, "That's very good, Linus. It shows you have a wonderful imagination. What do you see in the clouds, Charlie Brown?" Charlie Brown says, "Well, I was going to say I saw a ducky and a horsey, but I've changed my mind." You never know which ideas you have will stick with people through the years, but that one always seemed to. For 50 years, I drew Peanuts, and it was all mine. It's all my writing, all my artwork. Everything in that strip is me, except the name, Peanuts. That was the syndicate's idea. In fact, when the strip had some success, I pleaded with them we could change the name. Good old Charlie Brown. You see, that's a good name for a comic strip. But then again, that's all part of it, isn't it? These compromises. You see, my art, it isn't a pure art in the way that, say, Andrew Wyeth's is. Cartooning is a fairly sort of proposition. You have to be fairly intelligent. If you were really intelligent, you'd go do something else with your life completely. You have to write fairly well. If you wrote really well, you'd be a novelist. And you have to draw fairly well. If you drew really well, you'd be a painter. So it is a great profession if you are a fairly sort of person, like me. And I think being fairly is just fine. To look at my life growing up, there's nothing very remarkable about it. I was born November 26, 1922 in Minneapolis, but raised in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm the son of a barber and a homemaker, and an only child. My parents named me Charles Monroe Schulz, which is a good, strong name that pretty much no one in my life ever called me. See, I was just a baby when an uncle came to visit, and he picked me up and something about me reminded him of the horse Sparkplug in the old comic strip Barney Google. So he called me Sparky. The name stuck, and perhaps right then and there, a connection between myself and the comics was made. Growing up, though, our lives revolved around my father's barbershop. Every day after school, I would rush over and I would sit in one of the empty chairs and I would just listen as he talked to his customers. Or if it was a particularly slow day, we would sit and we would pore over the newspaper comic strips together. That was our one great indulgence, was buying all the newspapers in St. Paul just for the different comics they had. I made Charlie Brown's father a barber as well, and once in a strip, Linus supposes that barbers must be very wealthy people because after they pay off the scissors, the rest is pure profit. In truth, money was a little tight growing up, though I never seemed to notice. My first memory of being recognized as having any sort of artistic ability came early on in my life. It was kindergarten, and in my mind, it's the first day of school. The teacher passes out these big white sheets, paper, and black crayons, and tells us we can draw anything we want. And so I drew a man who was shoveling snow against a palm tree. She came around, she saw it, and she picked it up, and she held it up for the whole class to see, and she said, "Someday, Charles, you are going to be an artist." Now, she didn't have it quite right. She didn't say cartoonist, but still there was something to this. I had drawn the shovel as a square, and I knew that wasn't quite right. Even at that young age, I knew something about perspective. I didn't know how to fix it yet, but I always liked to think that was a sign of what was to come. My scholastic career was off to a wonderful start, though, and in first grade, I was named the most outstanding boy student. I was moved ahead through third and fourth grade until I had the privilege of being the very smallest kid in the whole class. I got to middle school and failed everything in sight. High school, I'm afraid, wasn't much better. I'm almost certain that to this very day, I am the worst physics student in the history of St. Paul Central High School. But I kept drawing the whole way through. That was my refuge. And I was still in high school when I saw my work published for the very first time. It was a picture I'd drawn of our family dog, Spike. He was this precocious little black and white dog who would eat everything he could find. He would eat tacks up off the floor. He once ate a razor blade, and nothing bad ever came of it. And so I drew a picture of Spike, and I wrote, "Spike the hunting dog eats tacks and razor blades." My father sent it off to Ripley's Believe It or Not. And believe it or not, they published it. My parents, sensing some promise, enrolled me with the federal schools, later to become Art Instructions, Inc. They had a whole program just for cartoonists. And I continued on with them through the end of high school and for a short while after, until, with the Second World War, I was drafted. My mother was very ill around that time with cancer. I stayed by her bedside as long as I could, but there came a moment where I had to leave for training. She looked at me and she said, "Well, Sparky, this is it. We'll say goodbye now because we'll probably never see each other again." And I don't know that I'll ever get over that moment as long as I live. But perhaps the secret to life is, as Linus says, just hang around until you get used to the thing. But the Army. Now, the Army taught me everything I ever needed to know about loneliness. It was a hard time as a kid who'd never been away from home before, but even there in the Army, drawing helped. It seemed everybody I met needed a picture of Popeye on their letter home. And I turned out to be a pretty good soldier. I rose to the rank of staff sergeant of a 50 caliber machine gun squadron. We were deployed to Germany, where we moved across on an armored car that I commanded, and we called what else but Sparky. The 20th participated in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp, and I myself was awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge. The war ended. I came home, and like everybody else, I had to start looking for work. I was hired by Timeless Topics, a Catholic publication, doing the lettering for some of their stuff, comics, and I was hired by my alma mater, Art Instructions, Inc., to be an instructor for them. And for a while, it was just my dad and I living in that apartment above the barbershop at the corner of Snelling and Selby. But those days at Art Instructions, Inc., they were some of the very best of my whole life. I became great friends with my fellow instructors. There was Linus and Frida. And I started drawing these funny little kids with great big round heads. And I remember asking a coworker if he would mind if I used his name for one of my new characters. Charlie Brown said he wouldn't mind at all. But there was time then to draw. I was getting better every day, and I was sending out work constantly, hoping something would sell until eventually something did. Now, back then, if you were sending out artwork, you couldn't just make a bunch of copies and send it out. You oftentimes had to send original artwork and then an envelope and a stamp if you wanted that artwork back when they almost inevitably didn't like what you sent them. One day, I got a letter in the mail from the Saturday Evening Post, and it said, "Mr. Schulz, look this week for boy in chair." And I thought about it, and I remembered I sent them a drawing of a little boy sitting at the end of a long chaise lounge, and he pulled up a stool at the end of it. It was just a little sight gag, but I had been rejected so many times at this point that when I read the letter, I thought, well, they don't like it, but at least they're going to mail it back to me so I can send it somewhere else. It wasn't until I was having dinner with my father that evening it occurred to me, and I said, "Well, you don't think they're going to print that, do you?" Sure enough, there it was. I sold 15 panel comics to the Saturday Evening Post, and I had a short-lived strip in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. It featured those funny round-headed kids and my Charlie Brown character. And for 3 years, they ran in the women's section of the newspaper. But I could see it becoming something more, something bigger. And so I marched down to that editor's office and I made 2 demands. First, I would get a raise. Second, they would move my comic from the women's pages to the comics pages where it belonged. When they said no thank you, I took my portfolio home and I began to rethink some of these ideas. Little Folks had been a single panel comic, but what if I took these ideas and I stretched them out over 4 equal panels? And rather than just mail this thing off, I wanted to hand-deliver my portfolio to United Features in New York City. I bought a train ticket, went to New York, I stayed in a hotel there for the very first time. I was so excited the next morning I woke up, I walked over to 42nd Street where their offices were, in through the front door, and the only person there was a switchboard operator. She was very nice, but she explained that the editors worked late and wouldn't be in for hours. She asked if I had anything to eat. I said I hadn't. She said, "Leave your portfolio here and go find a bite and come back." And so I did. And when I came back, the editors had reviewed my work and decided to buy my comic strip. They loved it. They loved the writing. They loved the drawing. But they especially loved that my strip was a space saver. By drawing in 4 equal panels, it meant that a newspaper editor could expand the strip, they could shrink it, they could run it vertical, horizontal, in a square if they wanted to. Anything they wanted to do to fill blank space on a page. And the only thing they weren't sure about was the name, Sparky's Lil Folks. You see, they already had a strip called Lil Abner, and so that Lil might be confusing. And there had already been a strip called Little Folks, so we couldn't do that. I suggested good old Charlie Brown, but they wanted something which would reflect more of an ensemble nature in the strip. There was a show around that time called Howdy Doody. And in Howdy Doody, a host would come out and he would welcome an audience of children who he referred to as the Peanut Gallery. And somebody had the bright idea to call my strip Peanuts. I was 27 years old, and they were a major syndicate ready to introduce my work to the world, and I am forever grateful for the opportunity they gave me. But Peanuts is an awful, awful name for a comic strip. Nevertheless, October 2nd, 1950, the very first Peanuts comic strip appeared on a whopping 7 newspapers, 4 of which would continue to carry it for at least a full year without dropping it. But I had made it. I was now a syndicated cartoonist. A lifelong dream had come true. I rushed home to Minnesota with a newfound confidence. There was a certain little red-haired girl who I worked with over at Art Instructions, Inc., who I'd fallen very in love with. And I went to her and I said, "Donna, will you marry me?" And when she said no, she wanted to marry this other guy instead, there was no doubt that Charlie Brown was on his way. Losers get started early. But soon after, I met Joyce. We were married in 1951, and we raised 5 children together: Meredith, Craig, Monty, Amy, and Jill. We moved around a bit in the early years to Colorado, back to Minnesota, eventually settling in Sebastopol, California. I'll admit I'm one who goes in for the "it's a great place to raise the kids" line. And in Sebastopol, we had more of everything for our money, especially land. It was a beautiful estate at the end of Coffee Lane, hence our name for it, the Coffee Grounds. Now, in those early years, 1950 to 55, the strip would change quite a bit. In 55, I was awarded my first Reuben Award. And the Reuben is the highest honor a cartoonist can receive from the National Cartoonist Society. Mine was handed to me by the award's namesake himself, Rube Goldberg. Now, of all the changes, nothing changed more in the strip. Nothing got bigger than the dog. I knew I was going to have a dog in my comic strip, and I had the perfect name picked out for him, too. Sniffy. But wouldn't you know, somebody else had already used the name Sniffy for their comic dog. I was back to the drawing board. I mentioned that dog we had growing up, Spike. We loved Spike, and when he passed, we talked about getting another dog, but we never got around to it. My mother always said, though, that if we got another dog, we had to call him Snoopy. And it just so happened my next dog was a cartoon one. And in the beginning, he really was just a dog. He walked around on all fours. He could always understand what the children were saying to him, but the audience had no idea yet what Snoopy was thinking. Then one day, Linus needed somebody to play hockey with, and so I let him stand up on his hind legs just for a bit. And then on December 12th, 1958, Snoopy first crawled up to sleep on top of his doghouse. And after that, I let my imagination run wild with him. He could drive a Zamboni on a bird bath. He could write the not-so-great American novel, and he could, of course, battle the Red Baron in his Sopwith camel. A common question that you receive as an artist is, well, where do your ideas come from? And I tell people, honestly, I don't know. But I do know that they are my ideas. Oftentimes people think if you write a comic strip about kids, you have 5 children, you must just watch what they do and write that down. That isn't how this works. Almost none of my ideas come directly from my children. But there is one, which my son Monty will take credit for, and that's that when we were in Sebastopol, he came into my studio playing with a model of the Red Baron. And seeing it, I immediately drew a little flying cap on Snoopy, and I knew I had something special there. I never could have predicted how big Snoopy would become. But then again, I never could have predicted how big any of this would become. In time, Peanuts would be running in over 2,600 newspapers, read by more than 250 million people a day, and translated into 25 languages. Does that kind of success change you? I don't know. You see, I don't think I've ever grown up, at least not completely. I find that I still feel out of place most of the time. Sometimes I've had trouble traveling, become almost agoraphobic. I will always be an anxious person. Somebody asked me in an interview once, "What are you anxious about?" I said if I knew that, I wouldn't be anxious anymore. But drawing is that one thing which helps me to survive from day to day. I know that in that studio, in that place, that is where I belong, in that room, drawing pictures. And if Peanuts had only ever been a comic strip, I would have been perfectly happy with that. But one day I got a call from Lee Mendelson, a television producer, about putting together an animated special with my characters, and would I be interested? And I said, well, sure. So he went over to try to sell Coca-Cola on the idea of a sponsorship. They were so excited about having sponsorship of the first ever Peanuts animated special, they convinced him to come back on Monday with a storyboard. The only problem was, we hadn't written a story that could be boarded quite yet. So over the weekend, Bill, Lee, and I, we got together and we began to throw around some ideas. It would be a Christmas special, a Charlie Brown Christmas. There would be a winter scene, a school play, and at some point, one of the characters would step forward and recite from the Gospel of Luke the true meaning of Christmas. My faith had become a huge part of my life, and I simply didn't see how we could do a Christmas special with my characters without at some point saying what Christmas was all about. This wasn't without controversy. I'd used scripture before in my comics, and there had been plenty of letters to the editor, letters to me from people who were upset and felt that the comics were just too low a place for such a thing. But I insisted we keep it. We had 6 months to produce the animation, an incredibly tight timeline, but Bill and his team finished 2 weeks before the air date. CBS ran it, and what can I say? People loved it. In 1966, we were awarded the Emmy for Outstanding Children's Program, and what a feeling to be a cartoonist accepting an Emmy. As I told them then, Charlie Brown isn't used to winning, so we thank you. But all the while you're winning awards, you're making animated specials, you still have to write your strip. You have to be 6 weeks ahead of the publication date at all times, and life is happening around you. The following year, my father came to visit us in California, and he passed away while he was staying with us. A fire ripped through my studio and burnt it to the ground. We relocated from Sebastopol to Santa Rosa, California. And it was around this time in 1972 it became clear that Joyce and I's marriage was ending. Joyce remarried, and so did I. I met Jeannie at the ice rink, and we were married in 1973. Peanuts would go on to set many records. We'd have marketing deals, and we'd have t-shirts, and I have people who do all that stuff. I am just a cartoonist. I just draw cartoons. People say Charlie Brown's story might be the longest story told by one author of one character ever, and I think that's fine. But I honestly never thought of things in those terms. I only ever hoped to get 2 or 3 more good ideas. I've always drawn from day to day. I've been asked more times than I can count if Charlie Brown is me, and well, sure, in a way he is. But really, all of these characters are me. To draw something like this and to keep it going for 50 years, you have to be willing to put all of yourself into it. And over those years, plenty of people wanted to have Peanuts be theirs, not just kids who loved Snoopy and wished he was their dog, but adults, intellectuals, philosophers. Everybody had something to say about my strip and what it all meant. So what did it mean? I'll say this. In Peanuts, all the loves are unrequited. All the baseball games, all the footballs are never kicked. All the baseball games are lost. And there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that it is funny. Failure is funny, and success isn't. The second is that life contains failure. It contains disappointments. Why were so many people touched by this one strip of the kids looking up at the clouds? Not because we celebrate what it is to be Linus and see all those splendid things, but because we would like to know that somebody else out there just sees a ducky and a horsey. In 1999, I suffered a stroke during surgery to treat cancer. I had had one years earlier that created a tremor in my drawing hand, but after this, it was clear that I wouldn't be able to keep up with a daily strip. I promised my children nobody else would ever draw the comic strip besides me. And so we prepared for the end. The final strip, written weeks in advance, was a simple one, just Snoopy at his typewriter, writing on my behalf. He explained why it was ending and said goodbye. Charlie Brown, Linus, Lucy. How could I ever forget them? Now, what questions could I answer for you good folks today?
Hold on. I'm coming with the mic.
How much were you paid when you first sold?
When I first sold Lil Folks, I was paid $15 per panel. I'm not very good at keeping track of how much money I have, as it's never interested me much. I still have pretty much the same sandwich, ham sandwich lunch every day and a glass of milk. But I'm told that the money has accumulated to some great degree. Of course, I am involved with a lot of different charities, recently having given to a World War II memorial. My status as a veteran has always been very important to me, and so I'm fortunate to have been very blessed by this career.
How did you feel when Snoopy kind of overshadowed Charlie Brown?
Well, I say with all of my characters, they're my children in a way, and I love them all, but there were moments where perhaps there was a little bit of pressure to keep on one storyline, to keep certain things going, but I always like to mix up my strips quite a bit. It not only, I felt, kept the audience interested, but kept me interested. So I always, when I'm mentoring younger comics, I always tell them, have enough gimmicks out there that you can keep things going. So whether it's going to be the baseball game, the football being pulled away, hunting for the great pumpkin, all these storylines allow you to perhaps keep that focus, at least in the strip, a little bit away from having any one true star and allowing everybody to have their place in the strip. Yes?
This is more a comment, but I know you've done thousands of interviews, but at one time in my life, I remember seeing you in an interview on television, and this one thing stuck with me, and that was, you said you hated to do your income taxes because the only thing you could deduct was a bottle of ink and 2 pens.
Yes.
And I never forgot that.
Well, and part of the reason I never bought pens, I started drawing with a very specific nib when I first started drawing the strip. And at some point, the company that made the nib was going out of business. So in 1 year, I bought their entire remaining stock of pen nibs, and I kept them in a closet next to my studio. But of course, doing any job for 50 years, you have moments where you get frustrated, and I would talk to my cartoonist friends on the phone, and I would say, you know what, this is it. As soon as I run out of pen nibs, I am done with this strip. Of course, they didn't know that I had a few thousand sitting behind me at that moment.
Is this on? Yes, I guess it is. Well, I have one thing in common with Charles Schulz. I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. So,
Is that right?
And I also lived a little bit of time in Northern California, so I certainly know where Santa Rosa is. But one of the people I worked with when I was in Northern California was an amateur hockey player, played in adult hockey leagues. And he told me that Charles Schulz was quite a hockey enthusiast. I noticed Snoopy plays hockey, but do you have anything about Charles Schulz and his love of hockey or playing hockey?
Oh, yes. Yeah, growing up in Minnesota, there was, I think in California it seemed that all the kids wanted to have a pool in their backyard, but in Minnesota, Dad would take the hose in the winter, he'd spray it out in the yard, and we'd have our own ice rink. So I loved hockey. When we built the Redwood Ice Arena, it was sort of twofold. One was to be able to play and see hockey. I was part of a league there for a number of years, and I also refereed a lot of the youth games there. My daughters were also involved in figure skating, so that was part of why we wanted that ice arena. But yeah, I may have left Minnesota, but the Minnesota never left me.
Thank you so much for being here and talking to us. I was wondering about the inspiration for Woodstock.
Yeah, so with Woodstock, he was an interesting origin story, perhaps, and that it's the most muddied. So he came about in 1968, but he actually wasn't named until 1972. So Woodstock, he is named for the Woodstock Music Festival. But really, there were just a bunch of birds that started hanging around Snoopy. And at first, I could not figure out how to draw them. If you look at early Woodstock, he looks nothing like the Woodstock we ended up with, which is, frankly, more of a Snoopy with a mohawk in a way. But Woodstock was really somebody who could inhabit Snoopy's world more fully than anyone else in the comic strip and go on those special adventures with him.
The attitude that Snoopy has, where did that come from? Is that when you made him the flying ace, or did he have that certain confidence, that certain attitude before that?
I would say it developed a bit over the years to where where him becoming the flying ace just fit with that sort of vibrato he had. Yes.
My question is simple. Did Lucy ever let Charlie Brown kick the ball?
She never did. In an interview I did recently, I said, you know what, that was kind of a rotten trick on my part, to never let the kid kick the football. But there was a reason for it. I mentored many up-and-coming comic strip artists throughout my years in the industry. But before I was a professional, I was a student as well, and I continued to be a student studying what was happening in comics all throughout my life. And when I watched what happened with other successful comic strips, as soon as they let the tension out, as soon as they let the characters get the thing they wanted, everything fell out of that comic strip and it was no longer interesting to the audience. So as long as Charlie Brown was still striving to kick the football, still striving to win that baseball game, I knew I had an audience.
Any other questions?
How about Schroeder and being able to play the compositions on that little piano? Where did that come from?
I love classical music, so I wanted a way to incorporate that into the strip. Of course, Schroeder is a Beethoven man. I'm a Brahms man myself. But I couldn't use Brahms because it doesn't sound as funny as Beethoven. I have an ear for what sounds funny in my strips. I knew Beethoven just sounded funnier than Brahms. So I made Schroeder a huge Beethoven fan. He was a wonderful character to play around with, but few people notice it is one of the most difficult strips to draw. If you look at the music that Schroeder is playing, it is real playable music. They are the actual notes from the concertos and such that he's playing. Yes?
Okay, hold on, I'm coming with the mic.
Sure.
How did the birth of the Great Pumpkin come about?
So the Great Pumpkin, it was perhaps a time when I was most enveloped in my religious studies. I was serving as a Sunday school teacher at my church, and I was thinking perhaps a bit about how people could develop faith in different things, and for Linus, playing with that idea of just unyielding faith, that had always been sort of a piece of his character. And I took it in a different direction there with his love of the Great Pumpkin. And it was just a lot of fun to play around with. It again gave that tension to the strip that he'd be out there just waiting for the Great Pumpkin to arrive.
I was wondering if your cartoon strip opened up communication between you and your children, especially when they were going through different times, because your cartoon strip often hits on, serious notes.
Yes, I don't recall having conversations about the contents of the strip with them, but they certainly loved the strip. They loved being a part of the generation of Peanuts. When my children were much younger, they loved to draw, of course, Charlie Brown for me, and they wanted to someday take over the strip in the same way that the artist of Family Circus was going to pass on his strip. And legacy strips were a big thing at that time. So they did have an interest early on in taking over and becoming the next Peanuts artist, but the characters became more and more associated with me, and the writing more associated with me, and so we decided that wasn't going to be the best path forward.
I saw a hand up in this area. Okay.
I went to Winter Park High School in California. And in 1965, I didn't plan the annual book at the end of the year, but it was all Charlie Brown characters, and there was a wonderful letter from Charles Schulz that was in the yearbook, and it was great. This is not a question, but it was the Peanuts characters were all throughout the yearbook. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm glad they made an appearance.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to what prompted the introduction of Spike, his brother, Snoopy's brother, and and his birthplace.
So Spike is from Needles, California, which is a place that I unfortunately lived. There was a brief time in my youth when, and to this day, my parents have both passed, so there's no way to go back and ask them. Something made them want to move to Needles, California. Some of the other family had moved out to Needles, California, and so we got in a car, and my father was selling fountain pens as we went along. That's how we paid for the trip, and we got to Needles, California, and my memory of it is as the most miserable place on earth. It was the hottest place in the world, and we were there for the one and only snowfall recorded in recent history in Needles, California, where it actually stuck. So that picture I had drawn as a young man, as a very young boy, of a palm tree covered in snow, I actually saw in real life in California. So Spike was sort of a nod to that strange excursion in my youth to Needles, California.
I was communicating with Ward Kimball, who is the #1 animator with Walt Disney. We were trying to date one of our artifacts, and I asked him, how can we date it? He said, you look at Mickey's nose. It's long and skinny, and as it comes backwards, you upgrade in time.
Yes.
Is there something in this cartoon strips that we can put a handle on as to when it was produced, or roughly about what period in history?
Most of it's pretty gradual, but I have been shy about re-releasing any of the comics from 1950 to 1955 in that the characters look entirely different. Charlie Brown's head is almost more of a football shape in those earlier comics. I just didn't quite have the hand for what I was drawing early on. Once we get to 1955, I feel like you start to see the characters come into their own. Throughout the 50s, there's a bit more play with camera angles on a lot of the characters as well, but once we get into the 60s, we really get into that sort of front-facing comics that everybody seems to associate with the Peanuts. Of course, Snoopy is perhaps the easiest to date the comic strips by, just in terms of the fads that he goes through. Of course, Joe Cool's a little bit later, and then all of his other iterations can mark the years a bit.
Any other questions?
You incorporated some famous people into your strips. Did you have any favorites?
Oh my goodness. I'd be hard-pressed to name a favorite. I was fortunate to have a few good friendships with some, I guess you could call celebrities through the years, and so I liked giving them little nods in the comic strip, especially with things that I was particularly interested in, like tennis, and to get to meet some of the folks out there and incorporate them was always a lot of fun.
Were you friends with Serena and Venus Williams?
I don't believe we got to cross paths just yet.
I'm curious to know if any of your children have shown a proclivity for drawing and or storytelling.
For drawing, when they were younger, they were interested in drawing quite a bit, but none really continued on with the drawing aspect of it. Monty is a wonderful writer, though, so he is a novelist and is an entirely different skill set, one that I am very envious of. But yes, he turned out to be quite the storyteller.
Sir, you've had so much success. What has made you happiest about your life? And also, do you have any regrets throughout your life?
I've been happiest to be able to do the thing that I feel I was placed here to do. One perhaps strange phenomenon to me in the comic strip world is that prior to my arriving on the scene, so to speak, it was common for a comic book artist, or a comic strip artist rather, once the strip became successful, you would hire lieutenants who would then draw the strip for you and write the strip for you, and you would collect the paychecks on the royalties. Somebody asked me why I wasn't doing that once the strip became successful, and I said, I've worked my whole life to be able to do this. Why on earth would I let somebody else do it for me? So I'm fortunate in that I've been able to have a wonderful family, a wonderful marriage, to have all these things in my life, but to really be able to pursue the thing that I feel that I'm best at in the world, which is drawing comic strips.
What prompted the Pigpen character?
Pigpen, I'd be hard-pressed to say where the actual inspiration for the idea of a kid clouded in dust. My boys were always out riding dirt bikes in the backyard, so that may have been part of it. But ultimately, Pigpen, the name, again, whenever I heard a name that I thought, well, I've got to borrow that. But I read Lord of the Flies, and so Piggy in Lord of the Flies, that name is the inspiration for Pigpen. But I always had an ear out for a good name, and if I had a good name, I felt I could make the character after it. The same thing happened with Peppermint Patty. I thought of that name one day, and I thought, I've got to create a character for Peppermint Patty before somebody else takes that name away from me.
After your stroke and you knew that you were giving up the strip, how did you spend your time, and did you go through any depression?
It was a tough time for me and my family, of course, dealing with the changes that brought on. But I was surrounded by, of course, my wife, my children, incredibly supportive through that time, and to be in my home. My home expanded from just my literal home, but also to be around friends at the ice rink, to be able to go down and have my English muffin every morning and to see my friends there. All of that really gave me a lot of peace.
A question and a comment. The question is the wah-wah of the teacher, which is used, referred to all the time in many walks of life still. Where did that come from? Was that from your early school days?
So that I have to give credit to Bill Melendez and Vince Guaraldi. So when we went in to make the first animated special, Charlie Brown Christmas, I'm often asked if I'm a big jazz fan, and the truth is I don't really care for jazz music at all. But I'm also not an animator by trade. So Bill Melendez is a fantastic animator, and Lee Mendelson, the producer. Lee had been traveling across the San Francisco Bridge, as the story goes, and he heard the Vince Guaraldi trio at a jazz festival, a recording of it, and he heard that song, "Throw Me to the Wind," I believe it was called, and he wanted the Vince Guaraldi trio to do the music for it. And I said, I don't know if that fits. And he said, trust me, it fits. So he brought the trio in to do that. When we were recording the soundtrack for the animation, we had a few little hiccups in how we were going to do that. One was that we cast actors who were so young that some of them couldn't actually read the lines. So you had Bill Melendez saying the line to them and then repeating the line back into the microphone with Sally in particular. But we needed some way to communicate these adults. Adults were never in the Peanuts comic strip. They've since been in some of the animations, but they never appeared in the comic strip. And people would always ask me, well, why aren't adults in the comic strip? And my official answer was that the frames are only 3.5 inches high and they just won't fit. But in truth, by not including them, we gave the children just so much more agency to go out and to have these adventures. But we needed a way to keep the adults off screen, so to speak, in the way that we did in the comic strip. So Vince's trombone player came up with the idea of muting the trombone and creating that wah-wah. And we thought it worked perfectly.
It has, and it's carried on through the years. And so the comment is, or the interesting thing is the connection to Wheeling, because Charles Schulz was good friends with Bob Otten, and through hockey. And that is how we got permission to use the Peanut characters as part of Festival of Lights at Ogilvy.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so there you go.
Any other questions?
Mr. Schulz, thank you for sharing so many facts and stories about your career. You've taken us up to the time of your passing, but there have been several people that have kept the story of your life alive. And we have a local hero right here in our city, Dr. William Mercer, who has collected and kept us alive. And I'm just thinking that as we wind down this program today, and maybe we get to the end of useful conversation, Mr. Schulz, that maybe Dr. Mercer would want to join in and offer his thoughts and what got him so interested in your life and your characters that he's been able to preserve, and many of those exhibits behind you he has generated. So with that, maybe Dr. Mercer has some comments and the two of you could interact.
Absolutely.
Boy, this is an honor I never thought I would have, to meet Charles Schulz. Boy, I want to get... Wow. What an inspiration you've been to me. and you don't know how you've influenced my life, and you've brought a lot here to Wheeling. As you can see, some of the things here, especially Joe Cool, actually helped make our city smoke-free. And your wife, Jeannie, has been a very good friend, and she's let me do a lot of this. I don't know if you remember Joe Garagiola. He was the baseball player. You did a comic strip on him for Spit Tobacco. He gave me a call, and we were using his information when we would go around to get our kids not to use tobacco. So, wow. Denny, thank you for letting me meet my idol. So, well, thanks.
Thank you.
But yeah, no, I got started when I was a little kid. I wanted to be Charles M. Schulz II. And I would draw cartoons, and I would take them to school, and I would sell them, but no one ever bought them, so that's why I still have them. But yeah, when I had an office in Wheeling in 1987, I had a pediatric room, and it was Snoopy. And from that day on, people just started bringing me Snoopy stuff. I try not to say stuff, it's paraphernalia, but stuff comes out. But here are some of the things that we have been collecting. Mr. Miller from the Kruger Street Museum has kind of let us display this, but it's been a lifelong hobby, and yeah, I tell you what, Mr. Schulz, you're awesome today. This was, you and James, this was incredible, and I'm going to let Jeannie know about this today. So, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's tough to follow up, but does anybody else have any comments or questions?
You have to be a big shot to get on our paper, not in the obituary. Why don't you show it to them?
This is the Monday, the 19th, the Wheeling News Register. Dr. Mercer's recognized for his anti-smoking crusade. This is, yeah, from yesterday.
Well, that is fantastic. We'll hold that up there. Yes. Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for having me today. I'll switch out of character here, and I'm going to just talk about Charles Schulz's legacy following 2000. So I present Charles Schulz as kind of his full life from birth to death. He passed away on the eve of the final run of Peanuts. So it wasn't planned that way. It was written weeks in advance. They all were. But he happened to pass away the night before the final Peanuts comic strip ran. Schulz, of course, continues to be beloved today. The work that he's created still resonates. Peanuts was the distribution rights for the animated specials recently went to Apple TV, and they continue to create new content of Peanuts. And as I understand, a new Peanuts movie has been announced that will be written in part by one of Charles Schulz's sons. So that storytelling will continue. But Schulz was a pioneer in his field. One thing I always like to point out is that Schulz came into a very different medium from what we understand comics to be today. So he came into comic strips when it truly was the visual medium in America. So in 1950, most Americans did not have television sets yet, and the newspapers were where you saw stories. So the stories that were on that page were typically saturated with ink. It was the Dick Tracys, it was Terry and the Pirates, it was all these kind of big, glamorous, colorful things, and then all of a sudden this tiny little strip appears and changes comic strips forever. Schulz, in that, when I present him, I always he speaks about the idea of not really being an artist, and that is something Schulz did almost infamously throughout his career, was really try and kind of push away this title of being an artist, as if he wasn't quite sure of how to accept it just quite yet. But truly, when he came into this medium, he was looking at something where comic strips appeared in a newspaper, and then they went away forever. If there were reprints of a comic strip, they were usually on pulp paper, and they were sold on a news rack at the 5 and Dime. It wasn't something that was meant to be preserved forever. When he started creating Peanuts and they started becoming reprinted and they're actually in bound books, he sort of pioneers that for other comic strip artists. He mentored a lot of the comic strip artists who are alive and working today. He had connections with a lot of the different animation studios as well. We talk about, it's cool to hear Ward Kimball's name come up. My other character that I do is Walt Disney, so I talk about Ward Kimball a bit. But he worked, of course, Bill Melendez had been a Disney animator. Schulz himself applied to become a Disney animator, but didn't make it past the first round, which is amazing. And he went on to create this incredible legacy. His wife continues to carry on that legacy through his museum, the Charles Schulz Museum and Education Center, still active with the ice arena there as well. And of course, Peanuts is on everything now. So we still have our lunch boxes, we still have our stuffed animals, so every kid can own a Snoopy. So Schulz really did change the game in terms of what was out there in comic strips, the way that we see comic strips appearing today. A lot of that, the literary nature of a lot of them, is attributed to what Schulz was able to do through Peanuts. But any questions for me as me? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Finding out how you got into this and having read the book, follow the book really well.
Oh, thank you.
But no, I'm just curious what piqued your interest.
Sure.
in
So
this.
Dr. Mercer and I have something in common there in that we both were going to be the next Charles Schulz at one point in our lives. My early years, I really wanted to be a cartoonist. As I got into high school, I started to move more toward theater, and so I went to WVU and I became an acting major there. I graduated and started working with some different theater companies, and then eventually came back to WVU. I work at the College of Creative Arts and Media with the incoming students. So I'm the recruiter. I work with our artists, musicians, and thespians. And I want to start getting back into acting a bit. And I had so many books around the house about Charles Schulz. So I have a lot of what the monologue is created from are his writings. So he did a lot of interviews, and he also wrote a lot about his art. He was asked to write about the process of creating a comic strip. So I pulled a lot from that. There are 2 biographies out. There is a more recent biography, and then there's one which Schulz was more participatory with during his lifetime, which is Good Grief. So Good Grief, I believe, was written in the 80s, and then 2007, after he passed, was the Schulz and Peanuts biography. So I did looked at both of those sources, but reading through his interviews and his papers was really interesting to hear his voice in terms of what he felt was important in the strips, the way he framed the artwork, his experience as an artist, and the importance of the different messages he was putting out there. He was, of course, I never got to meet him, but just seems like just a very funny, a genuinely funny person, and thoughtful and kind. So he's a neat person to portray, in that you can't help but like him when you read about him.
Do you think you could get us in the ice rink the next time we go to Santa Rosa?
Oh, yeah.
Tried twice.
Oh, really?
Haven't made it yet.
It's on my bucket list, is to get out there. Yeah.
Oh, it's a neat place.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Mercer's is better.
Any other questions?
So this has been amazing for me. I feel like I'm a kid again, in 1974, waiting for that Thursday evening at 8 p.m. when the Great Pumpkin's going to come on. It's so much different now. I always tell my kids, you can see this anytime you want. You can stream it. You can, see it on a recording. But when we were kids, it came on at a certain time every year, the same time every year.
Yep.
But you had to wait for it. So this has just felt like looking back in time, and just. I can't even thank you enough for the emotion that I was starting to tear up because I just feel like I'm a kid again.
Well, thank you.
So it's amazing. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you
And
very
thank you,
much.
Dr. Mercer.
Anybody else?
this is more of a comment, and it's in regards to, well, first of all, thank you, because there was a part that you gave as Charles Schulz, and where you talked about, you got to a point in your life where you decided to give Snoopy this full reign of jobs and activities. And actually, one of my favorite strips that you ever did as Charles Schulz, I know you're not Charles Schulz now, but you were a few minutes ago.
Right, sure.
Okay, so and it was and it's so simple, but it was from the time that before we had scanners in grocery stores. Okay, and on this particular day, Snoopy is a clerk at a supermarket. Okay, and somebody's checking out, and that's before you had scanners. So Snoopy is reading, the price of the product, and he says, milk, 89 cents, bread, 79 cents, peanut butter, and there's no mark on it. And so Snoopy yells back, "Hey, Charlie, how much on the peanut butter today?" And Charlie yells back, like 89 cents. And then Snoopy looks at you. He breaks that, what do they call that?
The fourth wall.
The fourth wall. He looks at you, the reader, and he says, "I knew the price. I just like to yell at old Charlie." And that has forever stuck with me. So when you talked about the creative aspect of Snoopy's life, that hit home with me. Thank you.
Okay, so we're about out of time, so I just want to make sure we thank James for outstanding performance.
Thank you.
And I want to bring Nanette out here. Come out. She's in the hallway. Nanette's the one who curated all this. Everything you see upstairs and down, she did all the work on it. And Mr. Miller from the museum, thank you for the loan. And Dr. Mercer, thank you for the loan. And thanks, Julia, as well, for all the hard work. And thank you to all of you for coming, and we'll see you next week.